Well, we don't always do introductions because if we've got enough of these videos and we've got some people repeating, but since we've got a different mix. Hey, who are you people? Let's start with Jim because he actually started it before we were recording. Hey, Jim, who are you?
I'm Dr. Jim Davies. I'm a cognitive scientist at Tarleton University, specializing in cognitive psychology, philosophy, and artificial intelligence.
I'm Dr. Yoni Sobin. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm in private practice, and I specialize in treating OCD and other anxiety disorders.
I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher from Illinois State University, and thrilled to be here.
Hey, I'm Dr. Colt Blunt. I'm a forensic psychologist. Happy to join you.
Hey, Colt. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
Ever since the fourth episode of WandaVision, when we saw, I know they say Monica Rambeau in the movies, and a creator says it, but I lived in New Orleans, so I have trouble saying Rambo. It's Rambeau. So ever since Monica showed up, the buzz about that show has just lit up social media. I think we're glad to have something that is outside our real world to get excited about. We're glad to have the MCU back. After 3 episodes that, except for bits of mystery, were straight sitcom and amazingly true to the better shows of those eras. Now with the last couple of episodes, we've been seeing more of what else is going on, getting closer to an MCU story. And Paul Bettany says the last 3 episodes are essentially going to be an MCU movie.
Wow.
Nice.
Yes.
What is it about this show that's grabbing everybody's attention? Why are we so eager to talk about it and analyze it?
So I would like to, I'll start. To me, it reminds me of the best parts of David Lynch. It's got humor. It's also got mystery, but it's not just goofy mystery that you don't care about. It partially because we appreciate that it's in the MCU, trying to figure out how it fits in there, and the little clues they just grab you, and I just can't stop thinking about it. I want to talk about it, and I bore my wife talking about it. So I think that it's really good at generating curiosity. I think that's one of the attractions to it.
I think it offers a lot of the same things that I really liked about the first season of Lost, and that it generates there are a lot of things for discussion. I just hope they've got more of a unified vision for it.
Right. And then Lost
intended.
It's a low bar.
It is.
So I would definitely agree with you, Jim, in terms of the curiosity element. Like the first episode, I was like, I'm not quite sure what I'm watching. I'm interested, but I'm not hooked just yet. And then with each passing thing, as it got more and more human, and I saw a lot of little bits of the Tom King, the 2 Vision series, Little More Than a Man and Little More Than a Beast. The little hints to that whole series. I absolutely loved that, and just the whole human element to it, and just how much the psychology of what's going on for Wanda, I think is phenomenal, and I think it's depicted really, really well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a nice show because it seems like you can enjoy it in layers. You can enjoy kind of the surface nostalgia. There are all these great shows. They're doing a really good job of aping them. The cinematography looks great. It very much looks period appropriate. But then we know there's way more going on. So you can enjoy it on that surface level, or you can enjoy it on the speculatory level, which I think is fantastic, especially now in quarantine when we're just looking for things to keep our interest.
I'm very impressed at how they're unrolling the relationship between the unconscious and conscious self very well. They suck us into nostalgia in the first 3 episodes, and so we might as well be in our own unconscious mind, right? I mean, a lot of us grew up with those shows, and we just get into this very comfortable space. And then there are these small perturbations where Wanda and Vision look at each other, what's going on? And that's just small scale consciousness peeking through. And then these last episode 4 and 5, Wanda just calmly walks out of her border and says, leave me alone. This is my world. I'm keeping it this way. And so you see this total literal breach of her unconscious world with the rest of the quote unquote conscious world. And I thought, kudos, like you guys, I didn't know what I was watching the first 3. I was just digging on it. And then it's like, oh, masterful. I really think they're handling it well.
Mm-hmm.
The breaking through of the unwanted thoughts is what reminds me so much of one of my favorite movies, Mulholland Drive, which is about a person who's living in a fantasy world, but but reality keeps like butting in on it, and until the whole thing falls apart. And one of my favorite movies, top 5 of all time, and WandaVision's really scratching that itch for me.
Yeah,
And I had
the way that they portray those like flashbacks, like, and how like flashbacks affect people, you know, in day-to-day life. Like suddenly like you're just there and suddenly you're in a completely different state, and there's this affect that comes in and this emotion, and it just kind of takes over whatever is going on in the present moment. The way that it's shown is very, very indicative of like so many things that I've seen with patients when they suddenly like a memory comes back, or like an intrusive thought, or anything like that. It's brilliantly done.
And I like just the idea of how we deal with grief. I mean, there's obviously so much going on for Wanda, and it really reminds me of one of my favorite Next Generation episodes, which was, I think it was called The Survivors. Anybody recall that one?
Which one is that?
I'm not a Star Trek person.
That is it's an old man who's omnipotent, who's not Q, who is he and his wife are the sole survivor of an alien attack on a planet. Basically, their homestead's there, everything else is destroyed. And you end up finding out throughout the episode that he is not mortal. He is this superpower. His wife was immortal. She died in this attack. And he just keeps bringing her back and creating this fake reality, this fake homestead that he lives in to deal with it. Because he couldn't deal with the loss of her. He couldn't deal with everything that happened, the loss of the entire civilization. So he creates this, basically this fantasy that he lives in. And yeah, it's a good episode.
Yeah, for me, the fact that Wanda's putting so much energy into sustaining this border. On the one hand, that sounds fantastical and science fiction, you're like, but we're all consuming massive amounts of energy. My single cells consume a lot of energy to maintain their integrity. My identity, I wear certain clothes, I drive a certain car, I hang out with certain people. All of that, I argue, is what I call boundary maintenance. Some people are in, some people aren't. And I love the way how they just explicitly build this huge boundary, and it feels like, I think Jim mentioned something about living in fantasies. I argue we all live in our perpetuated memories. We call them norms. They're unconscious. They guide what we do from moment to moment, unless they're ruptured because we're surprised. And for them to get that, I think they got it intuitively, right? Just to intuitively grasp how much we live in memory, nostalgia, and then get ruptured on occasion. Brilliant storytelling.
Yeah, it's interesting to think, like, you know, many of us will have various kinds of denial, but what happens when somebody goes into denial and they have incredible powers to manifest that, you know, those illusions into, you know, something that is incredibly vivid.
Well, and Wanda doesn't need to put up psychological walls. She can put up those physical walls.
No.
Yeah, and that idea of projection and how they show it also, if you think about it from that lens too, like what you show to the world, and like what you know to be true within, as well, and like how you can kind of break that and then go right back inside to your own like personal reality, as it were.
I like Colt's comment about grief. I think one of the reasons Wanda's generating these borders is to separate the traumatized self from the day-to-day self, and it's almost as if she's created her own ruin. Right, her own kind of existing ruin that serves to keep those two selves separated. You know, she did say that bit this week about, I don't know how it started, Vision. It just started. I love it. It just somehow, this is who I became, and then I just couldn't let it go. And so I had to invest more and more conscious resources in keeping my world this way until I just had to reorganize reality. You know, we all do that all the time. We just don't do it on that scale. But I love the idea of this bifurcated self and having a ruin to sort of pay testament to it. And how do you deal with that? How do you keep those two selves separate, which is what she's working to do.
Yeah, and how it also like breaks down when the confrontation occurs between, you know, the two people, between Wanda and Vision, and how that escalates, and then they're arguing and fighting, and before you know it, the whole thing is starting to fall apart at the seams, but we don't quite see that just yet. And like that's exactly how it happens in real life, you know, when someone has this perspective that doesn't necessarily line up with what other people are seeing, and leads to arguments and fights and separations and all sorts of falling aparts of various relationships. And it's just so indicative of how trauma really affects us on a very, you know,
right,
interpersonal level.
And how much is Vision the husband that she wants if he doesn't have the memories,
right? Or the free will to choose.
Yeah. And then if you scale that trauma up to a group, and you see things like the Black Lives Matter movement, where there's just societal rupturing of norms, it's happening at all these scales all the time. And I just love how we look at it and we think like we're watching a TV show, but a lot of the things that Wanda's doing is a lot of the things we see going on in our current world. And it's masterful. I have to say, I'm incredibly impressed. I didn't expect this show to be that. You know, Jim said David Lynch, Wild at Heart, you know, some of the best American storytelling. And I for a TV show, this is up there. I'm impressed.
Well, I think it's interesting earlier when, you know, Jim referred to the better David Lynch, or as somebody said, the first season of Lost. So we're talking about mysteries. We want a mystery where there is a solution, not where the creator is just making stuff up. Because Lynch has admitted there are times when he just makes stuff up to be weird. And we know that about Lost, even though they sold it to the network saying they had a solution. They didn't.
So I got a theory. I got a theory about this. I separate confusing things into there are mysteries which are figured out in the show, and the show gives you the answer at the end. Then there's stuff like I would say Star Wars is mostly in this, where there are things that we don't understand, but you trust that there is a reason that you can figure out, and it's worth talking about.
Yeah.
To some extent, Harry Potter's like that. And then there's something I call inexplicable wonderfulness, which is like Oz, not the prison show, but like Wizard.
Thank you for clarifying.
And then there's the flip side is inexplicable awfulness, which is a trope in horror, where there's a woman with no lips, and the fact that we'll never understand it as part of the scariness. And that, I think, is like more of the absurdity kind of thing, which is you can appreciate. Yep. But I think that there's a particular kind of attraction to a fleshed out world where it makes enough sense on screen, and what's given to you makes enough sense that you trust that there is an answer and it's worth thinking about. So when you're looking at Wizard of Oz, like why are there munchkins? Like, you don't even bother wasting clock cycles trying to figure it out, because it's just supposed to be dreamlike and glorious, you know? I love Miyazaki, but I think it actually might be a little bit better if the worlds were a little bit more rule-based. Maybe I'm wrong. And there were things to figure out. But when I watch Spirited Away, I'm not trying to figure it out like I'm trying to figure out WandaVision.
Yeah. That the feeling, I remember when we first saw the neighbors, and he was like sawing through the brick wall. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I know that this is gonna make sense. I know that I don't get it quite now, but they're doing a really good job of keeping me engaged and connected with this, even though I'm feeling totally out of the loop and like disconnected from the knowledge of what's going on. But I was connected enough and engaged enough that like I know that this is going to go somewhere, and I know that this is going to be a good reveal when it happens, and I'm just itching to find out what it is. And like that feeling like you're on the outside and you're on the inside at the same time as the viewer, and it's just it's masterful.
And it's fun to watch everybody's masks slip a little bit more every episode.
And to what degree are the other people in town aware of what's going on? We know some like Agnes are, but plenty like Norm, although we know that's not the character's real name within the fiction, so he's got actor name, character name, other character name, whatever. We know that they're not consciously aware of it, but they're internally suffering, all throughout. And I think that becomes an interesting way of looking at where you have whole groups of people who are suffering without letting themselves think about it. It was like, we don't know what's causing this within the story. We know Wanda's affecting it. We don't know if she caused it for that part that she doesn't remember, or she stumbled upon this town that who knows, some villain that I probably choose not to name right now unless I have to. They've been doing a really good job about tying into specific comic book stories. So I think it will be one of the villains who were behind some of these things in the comic stories. But beyond that, yes, we're seeing a town full of people suffering. Is Wanda selfishly just using that to indulge her fantasy, in which case her overcoming that may be what's necessary to help everybody else? Wait,
Just like her unconscious is breaking through, I feel that the people being mind controlled, their wills can be coming through also, and maybe she's losing control. But that cutting through the wall, I think of it like alien hand syndrome. When there's a part of your mind that you're not aware of doing something that you don't understand, he's cutting through a wall. That could be very symbolic for like, get me out of here. Like I'm trapped in here. And even if like the speaking part of his mind is not conscious of why his hands are doing that, maybe it's his unconscious coming through.
Well, and what about the dog? We know that people are playing roles. Is the dog a human? Is the dog a human playing a dog?
Was the dog suicidal?
The dog was suicidal, in my opinion. I think the dog started to become self-aware and hated his existence. And as soon as he got a taste of that, he didn't want any part of this anymore.
Ooh. I didn't think of that element of it, but that adds a new
dark.
spin.
Why in the world did he go licking the electrical outlet?
And then eating azaleas.
Yeah. At first my first thought was that Agnes had done something with him.
Those kids created him.
But then I'm going back. Yeah, it's like, where did that dog come from? Was he a stray piece of the big bad soul or whatever? Regardless of that, in and of itself, that dog seems suicidal.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think it's an important character difference that Agnes is aware of what's going on.
Yes.
But the gentleman in Vision's office isn't.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, he's able to exist in the moment in a way that he's not consciously aware that his mind's been taken over. And that implies something about who Agnes is. Mm-hmm. I won't go any further, but it has implications for why she's even there.
Well, it's in terms of if you're the big bad creating a town like this and there's somebody like Wanda in town, how do you put yourself in the best position to monitor or guide her? Could be as the best friend. However, you could be somebody else with awareness in town. You could also see that that's the person to be close to.
Every show's got a producer. Every show's got a director. I mean, it may all be Wanda. It may be somebody, maybe Wanda started this. Maybe somebody's pushing her in a different direction. Like, I'm really excited to see where this all goes because there are a lot of possibilities.
Right.
I really do hope that what they don't do is create a scenario where Wanda's able to think herself out of her trauma, right? In other words, that somehow she consciously has this epiphany and is out of it, because that's not how trauma plays out, right? You have to reconstruct your world, and that just takes work and work and work. And right now, she's doing the work. In other words, on the one hand, we're looking at Wanda saying, oh my God, that's horrible. Well, wait. What if Wanda were to just let her rage just come out completely? In other words, might be doing us a favor by managing the amount of rage that a being of her power can manifest. So I hope they don't simplify her situation. I hope they let it be as complex as it's been so far, because that's hard to do well. And
well, let's talk about Wanda's grief. Let's talk about the trauma. I got to thinking through the various characters of the Marvel Universe, of the ones we know the best, and she is the one who has lost every loved one. When we're first introduced to her, she has already lost her parents. She has lost family. Even before she loses a brother. Even before she loses
isolation too. When we first meet her, like the very first time we ever see Wanda, she's in a completely isolated cell.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And this is obviously this is an individual who can manifest their grief or anything else in other ways, but we are talking about someone who has suffered, and it's very recent. I think it is, even though Spider-Man Far From Home takes place later when they're taking on a trip, which I've had to point out to people thinking, maybe Peter Parker's the guy in witness protection. It's like that hadn't happened yet. For her, she just lost vision 3 weeks ago in her head.
Yep.
The things that are happening in there, some of it is definitely not conscious from Wanda, like how she says she doesn't remember how it started, whether that's her or a big bad. regardless of why, how much do the things we see seem reminiscent of real conscious and unconscious processing? Because despite public mainly thinking of unconscious without mainly think the word subconscious, which Freud stopped using after he got mad with the person who came up with that word. He did use it early on, but then he stopped using it because he got mad at Genet. But what does any of this mean in terms of what we think of as, whether we're talking automatic processing or conscious, unconscious? Do the things you see seem realistic in terms of human nature, or what might they represent in human nature?
I was just saying, to a large degree, the intrusive memories element, and how those things can completely overtake your sense of awareness in present moment. Like those first couple moments where you see some indication that her brother is like a real person and she's thinking about him, and how oftentimes, like generally, she's not thinking about him. And then those little tiny moments where it peeks through and you see the emotionality come through and change the entire dynamic of what's going on in the room. I think that's a really a powerful representation of what goes on in the human mind when someone is faced with a reminder of their past that they haven't thought about or considered or paid any attention to, in 10 or 20 years, and kind of that sudden change in the interpersonal relationships, and how that can completely change and throw somebody else off, and you'd be like, are you okay? And like the checking in that people do with Agnes, and when they were sitting on the couch when the stork was there, and I think that was the first time we saw an indication of the brother somewhere around there. So from that perspective, I think in a trauma lens, trauma can really affect it affects the neural wiring of the physical and the physiological brain, and those various regions, and how that then affects your executive functioning skills and your processing skills and your memory as well. To the point where you can be surprised by something from your own past when it doesn't appear in the way that you expect it to appear. I think much like that last moment in the last episode, where she's confronted with something from her past that doesn't look the way that she remembers it or appear the way that she remembers it.
Yeah, to me I think of it like dreaming. I think there have been enough Hydra references for me to suspect that this was maybe started by Hydra. So her subconscious mind is creating the world. And that's what happens when we're dreaming, right? We don't have conscious control over our dreams. We accept the world as it is, and we're not privy to or in conscious control of what is being created. But also think about dreams, that we can have lucid dreams once in a while. And to me, her starting to realize that she's actually doing this is kind of like a person going lucid or in and out of lucidity in a dream, but rather than choosing to wake up, she's choosing to maintain it. So in that sense, I think it is kind of realistic, right? Instead of creating just a dream, a hallucination in her head, she's actually like manifesting it in the world. That's because she's a superhero. That's what I see it as kind of realistic in that way of looking at it that way.
And she's really doing something that I think a lot of folks would do if they could. I mean, if you had the ability after losing a loved one to bring them back and live in that reality and kind of shut out everything else. I mean, look at all the escapism we see from folks who are going through grief and trauma. I mean, she's really just kind of leaning into that, and she's just changing reality.
Yeah, I like that idea that what she's going through is just a high amplitude wave of what we all go through, right? And the energy she can muster is just projecting it beyond her own system. One of the things I think they're doing well, we have all talked about the conscious unconscious dynamic, is I like to talk about us as actually, I'm not going to say living in dreams, but I do say living in memory. Because, for example, when we're sitting here talking right now, none of us have any conscious recollection of commanding our lips to move a certain way, our throat to move a certain way, right? That's all unconscious memory that's being forced into our motor system so that we can behave faster than real time. We can plan faster than real time, but it's unconscious. So when you're walking down the stair with your friend talking about how he didn't understand WandaVision, and all of a sudden you start to fall because there's another step and you unconsciously didn't think there was, you weren't aware of your foot at all while you were coming downstairs, but suddenly now it's the biggest problem for you and you try to reorganize to get your balance. So I try to argue that, at the level of perception, action, and cognition, we're constantly running these unconscious memories primed by the context we're in and what's happened before. And we only get out of it when we're surprised, when the world perturbates what we're expecting unconsciously, or when our system is being reorganized by something like trauma and it actually perturbates itself. So I think we don't have to have trauma to live in that world, because I think that's how the brain works. The trauma forces different things. And in her case, this high amplitude wave is just manifesting itself throughout, well, at least the size of a town, right? So I think it's very on target.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about the implications and effect of anger on kind of our ability to sustain or not sustain a certain particular reality, and how once Wanda starts getting angered, she kind of leaves the bubble, and she breaks it apart essentially while keeping it intact, and then retreats back inward after she's challenging this stimulus that in essence is saying this reality needs to break, and how she kind of goes inward more and holds on to it almost even stronger, which is something that happens a lot of times when people are challenged and confronted with something that in theory breaks apart the nature, the fabric of the reality that they're living in, and how that can lead to even more resistance towards a fuller acceptance of the things that are going on, and just how wonderfully that was depicted as well, and how the cracks also start to show through more the more angered she gets by this intrusion of these from these outside forces.
Travis,
Yeah.
Can I ask the therapist a very quick question?
Sure.
Do you guys have any experience with people who have actually had a conscious rupture, but then also have the conscious moment to say to you, I'm protecting myself. You need to know that now. In other words, there's the rupture of just getting mad and breaking through, but that's not what Wanda does. She actually comes out intentionally, dissolves her own boundary, confronts those who are trying to change her, and says, I am protecting myself, leave me alone. And I'm wondering, does anything that insightful ever happen in therapy?
Or that might just be like saying, hey, don't interrupt my nap. Leave me alone. I'm going back to bed.
Been there. Exactly, yeah.
In forensic evals every once in a while, and this is very superficial in comparison to what you're talking about, we'll get folks who will say, I'm not talking about that. It brings up a lot of bad memories.
Oh, okay.
The closest thing I've gotten, and there was no recognition in this, and this was kind of the working theory of a number of different practitioners, but I evaluated somebody who was accused of a very, very heinous crime, and basically throughout the process of charges and whatnot, really started appearing like he was experiencing dementia, like rapid cognitive decline, became nonverbal, and every examiner who evaluated him over the course of a decade or close to a decade said, this guy is never coming back from this. I get referred his case end of last year, and the reason I'm referred the case is because this guy suddenly starts talking out of nowhere. He's not back to where he was by any means, but he's back to kind of recognizing what's going on in reality. And it's like he almost has started to come out of that. And one of the working theories now is that he's just kind of been in this fugue as a result of all the trauma that he went through, and as a result of having to cope with what he is accused of doing. And maybe at some point we're going to get to a point where he actually has more recognition. But it seems like at this point he's just emerging, but he's not conscious of it yet. So maybe in a year, if we talk about this again, I'll have some great insight, but not quite yet.
Right. I'm thinking of one patient who I work with some like addiction struggles, where there was a certain kind of awareness of suppression of certain things with an unwillingness to address it and talk about it, coupled with an awareness of why they were doing what they were doing. But other than that, like in terms of like trauma memories, I've never worked with anything like that, but the closest thing was really just kind of addiction and denial and why a person drinks or smokes or does this, and that leads to certain behaviors and not wanting to talk about those things while knowing that they did it. So I think that there is a certain parallel there to certain struggles that people can face, but maybe not on that scale that I've seen, at least.
We've got Wanda as like, now is she going to accept the recast of her brother? If it is something like Jim was saying in a dream, I can see that being accepted, because the people we know, like when we get into a lucid dream, we can notice it's like they don't actually look like they do in real life. We'll accept somebody who is a completely different person being cast in a particular role in our dream. So if it's dreamlike, she may be able to go along with her brother having been recast, or it can also be like in real life when people have losses. It's common to seek out or latch on to replacements. You don't like to put it that way, but you do. You find somebody else to love, somebody else to get close to, or you may be afraid to. But for a lot of individuals, they lost the love of their life, but they may find somebody else again very soon because that part of them has this need. You lose a pet and you find a replacement for them. So do we see another dog die next week? Probably not. So how well do y'all think somebody would accept this recasting of her brother having a different face, not knowing about alternate dimension X-Men movies?
The folks that we're seeing, are they all basically folks who are cast into a role? In other words, are they all real people who have now been given a speaking role? Or has she actually created some folks too? Has she created NPCs in her?
Well, Vision's created, right?
But there's a body. She's incredibly powerful and she's got a great imagination. Is she just animating a corpse and projecting a face on it? I think that's a question I've got. Is Vision real? Is Vision conscious as we see him in WandaVision? Or is that all operating in here? I'm not quite sure either way. For a while, I thought it was completely a figment. Now I'm not quite sure because it's like Vision is becoming self-aware as well. But regardless, the question it brings up for me is who we're seeing as the recast. Is that somebody with that face who exists in that city and she's projecting this role onto him because she doesn't have the body of her brother, she doesn't have her brother anymore? So is she the one recasting an actual human, or is this an outside force?
Right.
Well, I've accepted Vision as Vision. We see enough of the personalities and the things we define as him that somehow whatever is him is activated. So I accept him as Vision.
Maybe. But like, if you look at imaginary companions with children, they become so automatized and out of control that they can do things that really upset the child. So just because Vision is not a complete puppet of Wanda doesn't mean it's not being controlled by a part of her mind. And I think he's also, I think he's reconstructed. I don't think it's actually Vision psychologically because he doesn't have his memories. So I think that I think it's a construction of Wanda, either an animated body or just manifested material.
And I would wonder if, as far as coping strategies for Wanda as a child, I picture her sitting around watching old American TV because that's what was available for her and maybe having an imaginary friend. So I wonder if she's kind of replaying those things now when she's faced with those traumas. She's regressed a bit and she's falling back into those old coping strategies, maladaptive as some of them may be.
That makes so much sense. We hadn't really gotten into the issue of why sitcoms. And individuals I've known who came from countries in Europe or who immigrated to America and learned their English from sitcoms, like our friend Janina Scarlett, who's mentioned that she learned that Urkel taught her English.
Oh,
to which
gosh.
I would say, did he do that? For a lot of people, especially from some poorer areas, but where they would have access to older American TV, and it would tend to be some older American TV, not the most current stuff. So that could be very much, even though she hasn't referred to that being part of her childhood, that would completely make sense.
Yeah, I remember I read something once about the Cuba back when there was more of a wall, that a lot of the things that were learned were from like American television from like 2 or 3 years earlier or 4 years earlier. There was like a delay and there was like a catch-up period almost.
Another reason to pick sitcoms is that they are an idyllic world where any problem is resolved in half an hour or an hour, So it could be that that is the closest thing in her memory to what an idyllic world could look like. And I like what Scott was saying about memory, because people should know that imagination is fueled by memory. Like, you can't have an imagination. Everything in your imagination is some kind of retrieval or recombination of things in memory, right? So she would have to have been, unless assuming there's not some outside force feeding her information, if she is indeed creating it all, she would have to have been quite familiar with the tropes of those television shows. And it's an interesting question why she chose to do it that way, because it could just be a fantasy world. but it's not. It's like it's television.
Yeah,
There's also the feedback of having an audience and how that can perpetuate a particular narrative, like with laugh tracks and stuff like that. Like certain shows might not necessarily get laughs if there was no laugh track or something like that, or no studio audience. And so I think that might serve kind of a cyclical positive reinforcement type of loop that allows the reality to continue to perpetuate itself, almost as though like she's not doing all of the work kind of thing.
The change in the nature of sitcoms over the decades is also going to reflect the change in what's going on with her. She's got to get more serious and face reality more. She's got to lose that live studio audience. She's got to at some point have to lose the laugh track, get into your very special episode and more serious topics.
I think it's going to change the MCU, to be honest. I think there are going to be things that happen that the MCU can't go back from in terms of how Wanda's story plays out. And
now, as we're coming up on the hour, Scott, you made me think of one of the strengths of this show. It had to be a weekly series. There's some people who are getting so accustomed to binge TV that they'll complain about a weekly series. But the ones that have a weekly pace, like Game of Thrones and Lost, we get to have dialogue about these things along the way. We get to have our water cooler conversations because those of us who got to see them quickly, we saw them at about the same time. When Netflix drops an entire season of Daredevil, you always have to wait. Okay, where are you? How many episodes have you gotten through before we can finally have a conversation?
No spoilers.
And so even aside from the story itself involving what were weekly sitcoms, I think it's so important that this one we get to break apart and we get to enjoy and wonder about along the way, where you can't with the binge TV. There are plenty of shows that they need to be binged. That's the best way to watch them. You watch it as one really long movie. I think Daredevil season 3 was a wonderful long movie. And I am so glad that WandaVision is not being dropped all at once. While we have even a couple of minutes left, anything we haven't brought up that has really struck you all about this show?
Where are the children? I mean, if this is a city, my working theory is this is a city.
For the children.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. We know that there are 2, and it seems like they're created, and they are more than anybody else. They seem to have powers of reality of their own.
And they're beyond her control.
Yeah.
So
just like the kids really are.
Was not in her control either.
Yeah,
she tried to have influence over the stork, and she couldn't.
That kind of sometimes like protection of kids that you'd see with like trauma responses and stuff like that, and how there aren't like the most vulnerable population is in essence the one that's not really represented in that reality in terms of inflicting some sort of alternative control on that particular group of individuals. And I'm just maybe thinking back to like maybe when she was a kid or something like that, some sort of psychological defense there.
Best case scenario, they are passed out in a basement someplace perfectly fine, and they're just not part of it for the exact same reason you mentioned. Yeah. But being this is almost like horror in the MCU, I think maybe there might be something to
if she actually gave birth to them, it's an interesting question of who the father is.
Yep.
It can't be Vision.
So I'm not going to do any spoilers. I will say that the kids and how they're being presented is extremely consistent with comic content.
It is.
And
that's another reason I think the big bad has to be one of 2 certain characters.
And
I think Agnes is something else which her name gives away.
What they've done with those stories in terms of, no pun intended, but magnifying the world of Wanda's mind is very impressive.
There's definitely a lot of horror.
Oh yeah.
Just in the conversation between Vision and Wanda, we're getting this strong, creeping sense of horror. And that issue right there about where are the children, that's the one that can give you chills. It's like, where are they? What horrible thing could be happening to them?
Yeah.
So on that note, where can anybody find y'all? Online, Twitter, website, whatever.
I got a podcast called mindingthebrainpodcast.com.
You can find, I have a YouTube channel where I do audiovisual podcasts called Dark Loops Productions, where I do very much what Travis is doing here. You can find me on Twitter at @dark_loops. And thanks for inviting me, and then fantastic.
You can find me online on Facebook at Nerd Psychology and on Instagram at nerd_therapist.
I've got a Twitter account I don't use all that much, but it's at DRBLUNT and the number 4 at Dr. Blunt 4. Apparently, Dr. Blunt 1 through 3 were, I'm sure, just other psychologists.
Who are these imposters?
Or a bunch of stoners.
That's more my guess.
I have always resisted making that joke around our friend Colt Blunt.
I always thought that name was so cool, though. Colt Blunt, man. I thought, wow.
It has this
name.
fictional hero kind of sound to it.
Does.
Definitely
Blunt.
does.
Colt Blunt.
The Adventures.
Definitely.
And I am Dr. Travis Langley at Superheroologist on Twitter. Just look for Travis Langley on Facebook or Twitter. I'm easy to find. I thank all you guys for joining me. This has gone by so quickly. And thank whoever out there is watching us. We appreciate it. We're doing this for you. We're doing this to occupy ourselves during quarantine. No, we're doing this out of love of it all, and for you.
Excelsior.
Excelsior. There we go.
I haven't given this much thought to a Marvel series, I think, since season 4 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. with the framework. I don't know if you guys have seen that. That was the last time I think I got this like meta head heavy over like what is reality, what's not reality, what can we trust, what can we not trust.
I finished binging all of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. back in March.